Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 2 discussion. I've heard a lot of feedback from players that basically the game is more fun from level 1 to 75. Now, I don't know that everyone's necessarily going to agree with that, but it's a common thought out there. And if you find yourself in that situation, I wanted to put together a list of powerful leveling items that you can consider when leveling a second character through the campaign. Now, these are going to vary in rarity. Some of these are quite expensive and quite rare, but I'm going to keep these to things that someone that's only done 50 maps at endgame can realistically afford. So we're not going to be including ridiculously good items like Calandra's Touch in here, even though they would certainly fit the bill as powerful leveling items, at least in certain circumstances. I also want to point out one very important thing that's going to come to mind when you're wanting to trade for any of these items, and that is, on the trade site, currently items are listed in a counterintuitive order. And that's because the trade site is predicting that the value of divine orbs is lower than it really is. What you want to do is come to the trade filters and go and change relative to be looking exalted orbs only. And then when you hit search, it'll disappear all of those listings that are in divine orbs. Now for some items, everything's listed in divine orbs because the item is really expensive and no one wants to trade them for, 2,550 exalts or whatever the fair price would be. So for those items, it's not going to work. But for items where the real market price is in the 15 Exalted Orb range, which is going to be the case for a number of these, this is going to be the way to go. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the unique items that I want to suggest here. I wanted to go for a variety of different inventory slots, and I'm also not going to try to be exhaustive because there's a lot of other things that people can use. I wanted to keep the things that are fairly versatile. Now, I wanted to start with Idol of Uldurn. This is an item that is extraordinarily good in certain builds and adequate in others. It has some core stats that are really worthwhile considering. So from level 24, you can equip it, and it's going to give you more life than you probably have on an amulet at this point. It's got a pretty trivial amount of life regen, but there is a big difference between having 0 and having some. And it's got a decent amount of dexterity, 10 to 20. Ideally, you want one that's closer to 20, but sometimes you just have to make do with what you can get. But the real killer here is this line of text, skills have +1 to limit. Now this is not going to work for every single skill that you could use, but if you're using something like Orb of Storms, where you're limited to having only one of these down at a time, this can be a tremendous boost to the amount of damage that your character can put out, and it can do that at the same time as also being a reasonable source of life, and a reasonable source of dexterity, and a pretty mediocre source of regen. All of those are stats you want, so Idol of Uldurn is something to at least consider. Fair market price for this seems to be in the low double-figure exalts at the moment. It does seem to vary a little bit, and that tends to be the price for a corrupted one. If you want one that's clean, you're looking more like 13, 14 exalts. And if you want one that is very well rolled, like 80 and 20, then you're going to be paying more. But I don't think you need to be that specific. The item is not something you're going to use forever. It's not something you're going to keep on your character at level 90. So just get something that will get you to level 80 quickly, and then you can change from there. Keeping the amulet slot and keeping with things that are a little bit niche, Fireflower. Now, if you don't do what I was talking about before and insist on the trade site only showing you listings that are in Exalted Orbs, you will see a whole bunch of 1 divine listings for this item first. No, don't pay that much. Instead, you can get it for a fifth that price. Now, Fireflower is something that has a bunch of really good things on it. It does also have a drawback. You take 100 fire damage when you ignite an enemy. In order to use this item, you're probably going to have capped fire resistance, which is something you don't necessarily need to have by the time you're getting to the later acts, because you can equip this in Act 5, but you may not yet be at 75% fire resistance. So it would be good to have 75 fires, even if you otherwise wouldn't on your character. But the power you're getting here is pretty substantial, especially when you consider this +1 to the level of all fire skills can actually go up to 4. Have a look, they're quite expensive if you want one that's 4, and they do exist as 5 and even 6. 6 requires that you have catalysts on it first, so you need to apply fire catalysts and also get a very lucky Varlorb outcome. That's the best possible outcome you can get for this item. That's not going to happen very often, but more commonly, you're going to be using something that's got 4 to the level of fire skills, but it also has a big chunk of mana regen on it as well, and that's important when you're getting so many levels to fire skills. That's going to cause their mana drain to go up, and this is going to help meet that requirement. Additionally, this has item rarity on it. Rarity is a completely broken stat at the moment. I don't think it's going to remain that way. I think grinding your games are going to fix some of the problems that the game's loot systems have, and a lot of those revolve around item rarity, but for the moment, it is completely and utterly busted, so keep that one in mind. Anyway, that's Fireflower. Again, a very niche item, and it is one that comes on later in the campaign, but it's also one that you'll use longer in maps, which is why I feel it's alright to include in a leveling guide. Next we have Ligurium Talisman. Now this is not going to be appropriate for most builds, but if you have really bad issues with intelligence requirements and spirit requirements simultaneously, then you might want to consider Ligurium Talisman. Note that this is going to turn off your life regeneration and grant you an equal amount of energy shield regeneration, which is something that may or may not be desirable. Ultimately, I just wanted to mention this because I think it's going to be perfect for maybe 2% of people watching this video, usable for 18%, and complete trash for the other 80%. But if you're in that 2%, then you really want to know that this item exists. And because it is such a narrow appeal, it is a very cheap item. Jumping over to things that you don't get access to until Act 3, Snakepit. This is a phenomenal ring in certain circumstances. You need to be a spellcaster, you need to be firing projectiles. If this is not the case, then Snakepit does nothing for you. But if you do tick both of those boxes, there's a lot of power here. So projectiles from spells cannot pierce is a drawback, but it's probably a nothing drawback for most people. And if it's in your right ring slot, which is where you generally want to put this on, projectiles from your spells chain an additional time. Chaining is incredibly good for killing stragglers behind you, and therefore for getting more XP while you're running through combat zones. This is why this item is so good. Now, it's one of the rarer uniques on this list. I don't think it's one of the rarest uniques in the game, but I do suspect that it might be in the second rarest category of uniques. So it may not be something that's super accessible when there's a new league start, a new economy, but it is something to keep in mind if you're leveling a second character right now. You'll also notice if you look at the trade site, a lot of these are getting corrupted. That I think is primarily people chasing after Vaal enchantments that you can get on rings in Path of Exile 2, and potentially also trying to push the cast speed beyond normal limits. So with a Vaal Orb, it can modify the rolls on that, and it can push them up to as high as 18, maybe even 19% on this item. All right, so next we have Lifesprig. Now, I want to say with Lifesprig, this is an item that can have a very large amount of variety in the minimum level that it has. That's because the level that it drops at determines the level of the mana drain skill that it has, and the level of the mana drain skill that it has determines the minimum level to equip it. If you see a Lifesprig that requires level 78 on it, it is a complete and utter garbage item. You can completely pretend it doesn't exist. But if you filter by lowest level, so click once for highest, click once again for lowest, you'll see that they are available for much lower minimum levels. In fact, they go as low as minimum level 1, but more commonly you'll see them at 2 and 3. Now when you have a look through here, what you're looking for is one that has +3 to the level of all spell skills, or alternately, one that's got 1 or 2, and then you place a YOLO Vaal Orb on it. That's what you're going to want to do. How do these items get created? Is it that someone is getting extremely lucky very early in the game and looting a Lifesprig? Maybe that happens once or twice, but far more commonly, these get created through the use of an Orb of Chance. Orbs of Chance seem to me, from what I've heard from other players that have really done a lot of testing with them, it seems that they definitely respect the rarity of unique items, and Lifesprig is one of the most common unique items in the game, which means that it's something that if you can find an Attune Wand base early in the game, one that has a low level mana drain on it, then applying Chance Orbs to that has a reasonably good chance of getting you a Lifesprig. Now, if you hit 3 on it, fantastic, but if you hit 1 or 2 to the level of all spell skills, it's not already usable, but if you apply a Vaal Orb, one of the outcomes that can happen is that it can get divined and then potentially even extended beyond normal limits, and that can be a way that you can get 3, or even with miraculous luck, you might even get a 4 there. So don't buy one of the ones that's 50 or 60 Exalts. Instead, make your own with an Orb of Chance. That seems to be the way to go for Lifesprig. Next, we're going to get to something that changes the way your character plays completely. Birth of Fury is not for everyone. Birth of Fury, however, is very, very strong. By default, this says drop ignited ground while moving, which lasts for 8 seconds, and ignites as though dealing fire damage equal to 10% of your maximum life. With a lucky Vaal Orb, this can get pushed up to 12%. Additionally, this has 15% movement speed, which is not as much as you want, but it's still something useful, and it's got some life and fire resistance. The key thing for Birth of Fury that makes it decent is that it's something that can kill monsters that are behind you. The same mechanic as why I suggested Snakepit here. It's something that can just kill monsters as you're running ahead of them, so that you're gaining XP while you're just running from objective to objective throughout the campaign. This is a really strong option if you can make it work. But if you don't want boots that change the way you play, then you've always got the option of Wanderlust. Wanderlust are very, very basic, very, very strong. Your speeds aren't affected by slows, but more importantly, 20% increased movement speed. Did I mention there's some dexterity as well? There's some dexterity as well. You can use these from late in Act 1. They're really, really good. And you're unlikely to get better until late in Act 4, maybe even in Act 5, when 25% movement speed gets added to the loot tables. And at that point, you're more likely to see something that's an overall cohesive whole that's superior to Wanderlust. Until that point though, Wanderlust will have served you really well. And once you no longer need them, sell them on. Let someone else wander through the game using the Wanderlust that you used yourself. Next, we're going to talk one of the most common cast uniques in the game, Doedre's Tenure. This is also, just like Wanderlust, something that's been pulled over from Path of Exile 1. This is a very simple set of gloves, but also a very powerful one. 100% increased spell damage is massive. Now, this is something that is tremendous early in the game, but because it's only additive with other sources of increased spell damage you might have on your character, or for instance, increased fire damage if you're casting Fireball or whatever it happens to be, and there's only going to be additive, so it means that early on, it's going to double your damage. But after a little while, it's not going to be double anymore. It's going to be taking you from 170% base to 270% base, or from 300% base to 400% base. Eventually, you'll completely outgrow it. You'll reach a point where you've got 500% base without it, 600% base with it, and then the drawback, which is real, of 25 to 15% reduced cast speed, this is going to start feeling overpowering. These gloves are really good, but you don't want to wear them forever because reduced cast speed is a very, very real drawback. That said, they do so much and for such a small price that I had to include them in this list. Please don't keep wearing these into Act 5, Act 6, but do wear them Acts 2, 3, and 4. They will serve you very well there. And I want to finish with two things in the helmet slot. So firstly, we're going to look at Goldrim, which is another item that is in POE 1 as well. Now, this is just a helmet that gives you a tremendous amount of additional resistances, but it also provides you with rarity, and rarity is kind of broken, even though this is not an endgame amount of rarity. Now, Goldrim is going to give you between 25 and 35 to all of your elemental resistances. This is a really, really big deal because resistances are a bit harder to come by in Path of Exile 2 than they were in Path of Exile 1. Additionally, you can stick on this hat at level 10, so far earlier than other comparable items. The rest of the mods on it are pretty mediocre. Well, it's really just evasion rating, but then there's also space to put in an extra rune socket, which can then boost up one of your other resistances you're having trouble with. All in all, Goldrim does a lot. It does a lot for a very long time. This is a sort of item that you might want to use until you're realistically in maps, maybe even a little bit past getting into maps, and that's very, very strong for something that you can stick on late in Act 1. The other alternative, though, is something with even less text on it than Goldrim, and that is Thrillsteel. This item is also in Path of Exile 1, and it gives you a big speed boost. There's something to be said about speed in Path of Exile 2. It's even more powerful than it is in Path of Exile 1, and Onslaught is just a lot of it. That's all this helmet does, but it's something that is very, very appreciated. Anyway, that's a list of some unique items you might want to consider if you're rolling a second character in Path of Exile 2. Most of these items are probably out of reach when you're on a first playthrough, although there are definitely some that you can pick up for 2 or 3 Exalted Orbs sometimes, but most of them are in the double figures. Hopefully that's been useful to you. May your Val Orbs have interesting results, and I will see you around.